She walked in silence, not because she was voiceless, but because the world never learned how to listen. Echo was never meant to scream. She was meant to be felt, to ripple through the noise with presence alone. But even presence needs space to exist. Her story was built in the spaces others overlook, a legacy of pain, of identity, of stillness turned into strength. She didn't need flash, she didn't need fame, she needed a chance. And the cruel truth is, Marvel never gave her one. While other heroes soared with fanfare, she was left to crawl through shadows. Not because she couldn't rise, but because no one showed up to watch her try. And in that empty silence, her voice was stolen before it could ever echo. They dropped her into the world without armor, without warning, without weight. Like a whisper released in the middle of a storm, not hoping she'd be heard, but knowing she wouldn't, and still calling it a debut. It wasn't a failure of character, it was a failure of care. Not a mistake in the story, but in the way it was handed to the world. A story told with heart, but held with indifference. And when you hold something loosely, it slips through your fingers. In this video, we break down how Echo was set up to fall. We explore the silence that surrounded her, the absence that defined her release, and how Marvel's quiet neglect spoke louder than any review. We'll uncover why Echo didn't fail the audience. The audience was never given a chance to see her. Echo was supposed to be different. A bold voice in a crowded universe. A story rooted in culture. Silence. Identity. Something that could reshape what Marvel meant for the street-level world. But before it even breathed, it was buried. And the silence surrounding it spoke louder than any premiere. There were no press tours, no billboard campaigns, no teasers that stirred the internet into a frenzy. It slipped into release like a whisper lost in thunder. Not because it wasn't ready, but because it was never given the chance to shout. And when it finally arrived, it felt like no one had been told it was coming. You expect a studio to champion its creation, to stand behind its risks, to show the world why this one matters. But with Echo, there was only absence, only a shrug, like it had already been forgotten before it arrived. And that forgetfulness felt deliberate, like erasure masked as scheduling. And we watched, not with anticipation, but with confusion. Because something felt off, something felt hushed. A silence that didn't come from the character, but from the studio around her. And that silence grew louder the closer release day came. It wasn't failure by accident, it was silence by design. And that silence said more than any trailer ever could. Because when a story drops without a sound, it often means someone wanted it to be buried. This wasn't just a lack of promotion, it was an erasure. A quiet push into the shadows of the release calendar, dropped all at once. Without warning, without care. As if Marvel had made up its mind before the audience even pressed play. And that decision felt less like a rollout, and more like a resignation. They didn't stagger episodes, didn't build momentum, didn't treat it like a moment. Instead, they buried it under louder projects, louder headlines, louder distractions, and let it disappear without a fight. As though attention was a resource they refused to waste. It deserved more than that, because even flawed stories deserve spotlight. They deserve space to breathe, to find their people, to prove their worth, not be discarded like a placeholder in a lineup no one's tracking. And Echo never got the room to prove what it could be. You could feel the indifference in every silence, every missed opportunity. Every time Marvel chose not to remind the world Echo was coming, like they were daring the series to fail, and calling it a win if it did. Because low effort means low accountability. And the saddest part is that they pretended it was strategy, when in truth, it felt like surrender in disguise. A calculated retreat dressed as creative release. This was a story built on pain, on trauma, on silence used as strength. Echo wasn't just a character, she was legacy, she was grief, she was identity forged in the absence of sound. And that kind of story needed care, because stories born in silence need someone to raise their voice. But Marvel didn't handle it with care. They treated it like an obligation, a checkbox, a delay before the next spectacle. And in doing so, they silenced the very story that was supposed to speak for those unheard. A story that deserved to be amplified, not muted. Maya Lopez was never meant to be perfect. She was meant to be real, broken, healing, fierce in her quiet. But all of that got lost. Not in the writing, not in the acting, but in the way the show was abandoned. As if its nuance was too inconvenient to spotlight. No spotlight, no conversation, no push. Just release and retreat. And in that retreat, the character was left to carry the weight alone, without the studio that created her standing beside her, and the silence became a burden she was never meant to hold alone. And when a story is left to walk alone, it doesn't fall because it's weak, it falls because no one helped it stand. And that fall hurts more when you realize it was preventable. Because Echo had something rare, a heartbeat that felt different, a rhythm that pulsed outside the formula, a voice that spoke even in silence. And when it hit with soul. The kind of soul you don't see enough in the genre anymore. It was gritty without being soulless, vulnerable without begging for pity. It honored culture without turning it into decoration. It felt lived in, worn, honest, and that honesty made it worth hearing. Because truth like that doesn't need volume to matter. The action wasn't loud, but it was brutal. The drama wasn't grand, but it was raw. And every frame felt like it came from a place that meant something. Something more than spectacle. Something that demanded presence, not applause. There was beauty in the silence, in the stares, in the weight behind every choice. And in the end, it proved that power doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it comes with stillness. And that stillness was deafening in all the right ways. And for all its imperfections, Echo had the bones of something great. Something real. Something Marvel didn't seem to see, or chose not to acknowledge out of fear it wouldn't fit the mold. Because even when abandoned, stories like this find a way. They move quietly, softly, through word of mouth, through connection, through those who saw something in the silence, and carried it forward anyway. Fans who felt overlooked saw themselves. Creators who dreamed different saw possibilities. And in the cracks left by Marvel's neglect, something small began to grow. Not because it was watered, but because it refused to die. Echo wasn't lifted by a machine. She was held by people. By voices that refused to let her disappear. By viewers who felt the heartbeat Marvel ignored, and still chose to keep it alive. Because they knew silence doesn't mean absence. Because art doesn't need millions to matter, it needs meaning. And Echo had that. Even if the spotlight never found her, even if the stage never embraced her, she still left a mark on those who listened. And maybe, just maybe, the future will look back and see her not as a failure, but as the seed of something better. Something Marvel didn't nurture, but couldn't erase. Echo didn't stand a chance. Not because she failed, but because Marvel never let her fight. They released her without armor, without support, without belief, and let the silence do the rest. A silence that felt like betrayal in slow motion. This wasn't about quality. It was about care, about value, about who gets defended and who gets dismissed. And in that choice, Marvel revealed more than they intended. Because silence isn't neutral. It's a decision. Because Echo wasn't just another show. She was a shift, a signal, a chance to tell stories differently. And they let it pass like it never mattered. Like she was never meant to succeed. Like her story was too quiet to be worth hearing. And in that silence, they buried something powerful. Not because it was weak, but because they didn't know how to champion it. Didn't know how to hear it. Didn't take the time to understand what made it matter. And that neglect echoed louder than any review. And that's the heartbreak. Not that Echo was quiet, but that Marvel refused to listen. And in their silence, they proved she deserved far more than what they gave her. And now, we're left mourning a story that was never truly given the space to live.